Hey everybody, I am Alex Cohen.
And I'm Sara Sadhwani.
And welcome to another exciting edition of the Inside the Issues podcast. So much to talk about, including the great red state versus blue state debate between Gavin Newsom and Ron DeSantis and Sean Hannity. I think we can include him in that mix.
A three-way debate for sure. And of course, my favorite topic is back on the agenda. Independent redistricting is coming to the city of Los Angeles. We will break it all down.
And coming to the county of Los Angeles, something known as Care Court. This is Governor Newsom's big plan to address those really struggling with mental health issues. I feel like this could be a real legacy moment for him, but a good legacy, not so great legacy. That we will debate and discuss. But speaking of debates, let's just launch right into it. Okay, so Sara, this week we had the big debate between Gavin Newsom and Ron DeSantis. I think let's backtrack for just a moment. I know there's a lot to talk about what went down, but let's remember the origin story of all of this. It was actually, I believe, Dan Rather, who over a year ago had kind of just floated this idea on, I think it actually was even Twitter back then, saying hey, wouldn't it be so interesting if we're seeing so much of this clash between red state, blue state, Florida, California, if we could get these two governors together? And Gavin Newsom was like, yeah, I'll bring the hair gel, you bring the hairspray. He literally said this, Ron DeSantis. He was like, anytime before the election, let's do it. And I think most people thought yeah, it's never going to happen. But as time marched on, I think a lot of people saw why this might actually be advantageous for them. And it became a reality. Sean Hannity had Gavin Newsom on a couple times on his show and said, would you do this? And he was like, yeah, if we could abide by certain rules, yeah. I've got my thoughts on this, but Sara, maybe you could break down, what do you think was in it for even doing this for Newsom, for DeSantis, and maybe even for Sean Hannity?
Yeah, well, first of all, sorry, Dan Rather, it wasn't terribly interesting. It was interesting, but, honestly, it was painful to my ears because the two of them were just at each other's throats. You could hardly hear them. Interrupting each other the entire time. Look, what did they bring to this? Male ego, I don't know, right? What do we get out of this? This is Gavin Newsom, who is not running for president, but clearly Team Biden. And much of the time, he actually wasn't talking about California, but instead about the, pushing and advancing the successes of the Biden-Harris administration and defending them in many ways. And then you have Ron DeSantis, who is flailing in the polls, right? A year ago, everyone thought he was the best chance to knock off Trump in this primary election. That is not panning out for him. Nikki Haley is actually doing better in the polls than Ron DeSantis. So you have these two governors, this red state versus blue state. I don't know. What do we really get from this?
Well, okay, here's what I think they get out of it. First and foremost, I think, honestly, and this is the one thing I haven't seen anybody writing or talking about, I think Gavin Newsom did this because the dude loves to debate. And honestly, how much of an opportunity has he had really to do that in recent years, right? There's the recall
effort. Does he love to debate, or does he just love the spotlight?
No, I actually think he loves to debate. And what bolsters my claim on this, I think, is watch those appearances with Sean Hannity.
Yeah.
It is the strangest bromance frenemies. Apparently now, and I was reading this week, they text each other at night. And I think it's that they love to agree to disagree and to really get into the fray of it. Gavin Newsom's brain is wired in such a way that I think he's like that gifted child in a classroom where he's not being challenged. He gets bored and probably into trouble if he's not being met at that level. Doesn't necessarily mean agreed with, but he wants to get into that, and he hasn't really had much of a chance to do that as governor. And he's not running for president, at least not yet, so he doesn't get to do it for that. So just to have the opportunity to debate, to show I'm dyslexic and I can still remember 48.3 factoids and dispute your
sweet mom sort
claims.
Of approach on
No, I think it's what he needs to do, right? It's governing, and he needs more of a challenge. It's and it's not like governing California is easy or that he's doing a perfect job of it, but I think he's just hankering and hungering for more. Ron DeSantis, like you said, his presidential aspirations don't seem to be panning out, but I think this gave him, especially right on the heels of the third debate where it's really winnowed down to just a couple of candidates, it's showing, look, when it's me with a bunch of guys, I make those awkward statements and then I look at the camera and smile weirdly. But when it's me one-on-one, I can do this. I can, land my punches and all the rest of it. And Sean Hannity, who just for a moment, because this is key player in this as well, like what's his end game here? And I think he made it really clear at the beginning of the debate, because I think before he even asked his first question, he's like, as the longest standing anchor, and blah, 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 blah. I think he's also saying like, Mom, me too, I'm still relevant. I know Tucker Carlson isn't here anymore, but I am. I think his fatal flaw, Sarah, and you could see this, he got so exasperated over the course of this 95-minute debate, saying like, I don't want to be a hall monitor.
His hall monitor thing. Oh, he kept saying, I'm not the hall monitor.
I'm not the hall monitor. And then I think at one point,
maybe you are.
well, and at one point I think he was like, I'm not just some house plant in the corner or something. I'm pretty sure he said that. And I think, the problem is he wanted to show I can do a great job too. Like here are two governors showing that they want to do a good job as elected leaders. And I think Sean Hannity really wanted to show I do a great job as this moderator, but you cannot say that you are a moderator. He came at the beginning too and was like, we've researched all these things and we're really going to try to make it non-partial.
And we're all about truth and we have all these facts.
Oh my God. Like looking at the graphics alone. Yeah. And I'm not saying, right, like, because statistics, everyone loves to think, ooh, there's a graph. It must be true. But context with all of these things is absolutely key. And even though he hammered Gavin Newsom on things like abortion and, what is your stance on it throughout the course of pregnancy, like never took that same kind of probing tactic with Ron DeSantis.
Yeah, no, for sure.
So it was like, Sean Hannity, are you in this gig and moderator or not? Or are you just Ron DeSantis' cheerleader, in which case, like, no,
right, in which you're going to ask questions that clearly are going to, the framing of the questions ends up favoring DeSantis, right? I mean, I thought that from the get-go, in the very beginning, they open with a lot of questions around the economy, and I think in the beginning, Newsom really struggled to answer some of those. I mean, Hannity had to push him and probe him, like, so why are people leaving California? And he wouldn't give an answer to that, which I do think was. Do you think was there a good answer that he could have given? Well, this is something I personally thought about a whole lot, like. I don't know the great framing of it, and this is a challenge for California, but we are in a different position. The Sun Belt, all of the southern states, are booming and growing today, and we do have high cost of housing. We have had, developments of homes in places in our natural environment where homes simply should not be. Yeah. It is possible. Friends, no one wants to say it, but maybe we're at capacity to some extent, and I feel like we have to be able to name that, and I get it. Politicians are in really awkward positions, but like we lost a congressional seat because our population isn't growing at the same rate as other states, and there are very real reasons for that. I mean, when we look at the environmental consequences, look at Paradise, California, and the fire that essentially took out that entire town, right? Maybe we're at capacity and maybe we need to be able to say that.
That could have been, and now I'm going to channel my inner Gavin Newsom, like maybe that would have been the way to frame it, is almost by maybe shocking people and saying, you know what, I'm okay with some people leaving because that helps us get back in touch with our natural habitat, which I've been doing. Then you rattle off the things that you've been doing on the environment front. You could also say there are people who are leaving for Ron DeSantis and certain values that he's taking on book bannings, and I'm okay with that too. Right.
Yes.
We are, and he did say this at one point. Actually, maybe this is a good opportunity to give folks a taste of what this debate was like if you chose to miss it. And it'll be interesting to see when the ratings come out. But, a lot of it was very typical, like yelling over each other, politician-y kind of stuff. But there was one moment that I think was probably the most genuine moment of the entire night, which was when they were talking about parental rights, what's going on with education, LGBTQ rights. And Gavin Newsom was really hammering Ron DeSantis over the Don't Say Gay, what they call the Don't Say Gay law, things of that nature. And let's take a look at what Gavin Newsom had to say to Ron DeSantis.
I don't like the way you demean people. I don't like the way you demean the LGBTQ community. I don't like the way you demean and humiliate people you disagree with, Ron. I really find this fundamentally offensive. And this is a core value that distinguishes the values of my state and, frankly, the vast majority of Americans against the weaponization of education.
Now, I think one more thing that's in it for Gavin Newsom is that, look, Ron DeSantis has been on this national stage. Everybody kind of knows what his policies are. We know a lot about Gavin Newsom here in California, and I think people see him hop up on deadlines. But especially for those maybe Fox News viewers who aren't thrilled with Donald Trump, or Democrats who watch Fox News just to see what's going on there, I think this gives him an opportunity to show himself on a national stage for whatever it might be. Also, Sarah, another one of the most telling moments I thought in the debate was early on. They were going to a commercial break, or they were supposed to go to a commercial break. Gavin Newsom had just started talking, and Sean Hannity interjects and was like, hey, we have to go to a commercial break. And Gavin Newsom was ready to shut it down. And Hannity said, go ahead and finish your thought. So he finished his thought, and he said, and this is Gavin Newsom, but we'll have more ahead as we take on. It was like, holy cannoli. That dude isn't running for president. He's running to have his own show on MSNBC.
Yeah, he played that role very, very well. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, just stopping again and thinking about, like, what is this that we're watching? Yes, it is red state versus blue state. And I think what's so jarring to that is that it's not something we're accustomed to.
Yeah.
And typically when we see these kinds of debates, we're seeing a primary debate within a party in which oftentimes we see it within the party people moving to the extremes, right? So amongst conservatives, you'll see folks kind of moving and jostling further to the right, having to contemplate, the MAGA Trump politics. In the Democratic primaries, obviously we're not going to see too many debates because Biden is their nominee. But if we go back to 2020, if we go back to 2016, it was engaging with Bernie Sanders and that farther left politicking. And then when we finally see a red versus blue debate, when you have nominees, at that point they're playing to the middle, right? They already have captured enough votes to be the nominee. And so you have a median voter theorem, right? That at a presidential debate between two parties, they have to pick up all these folks who are kind of lingering within the middle, who are undecided, these independent voters. And I think that's what we are not seeing here, right? We don't see them really engaging with one another. Instead, they're just shouting at each other. And I think that is one of the jarring things about this, is that we're not accustomed to seeing this kind of debate, though we're very aware of sort of this culture war that exists between red states and blue states.
Because, I mean, yeah, it was a debate, but was it really, considering these were not two guys who were, only one of them is running for office, which brings us to the regular segment that we do here every week on the Inside the Issues podcast. We call it What's the Word? Sarah, the word is?
Upend.
Yeah. This debate has kind of upended in many ways. Will be interesting to see, is this some like little sliver in time where we'll never see something like this again? Or much in the same way that I think Donald Trump has taken the entire playbook around politics and been like, whoop, we don't do this anymore. Are we now seeing like, okay, we have had forever systems that worked, that we trusted in, that made sense to us, caucuses, primaries, this kind of calendar, debates, whatnot, and maybe now we're looking at it all and saying, man, it's 2023. Like there could be AI members of Congress. Maybe it's time that we just shift all of this. And I think this was kind of a nod to that, upending that system of traditional debates and having a moderator who aligns so closely with one of the participants. I will never let that go. But there's one more thing that I do want to talk about in terms of this debate, which is the concept of age and the factor that I had on this. I was speaking earlier this week with Mike Madrid about this, and he said, look, for us baby boomers, for us Gen X, we have not had...
You're not a baby boomer.
I'm feeling like it today.
And don't include me.
No, not at all. No, for us, the Gen X, we haven't had a president, right? The past 5 presidents are all these baby boomers, and there's a good chance, right? Like, look, it's going to be most likely, 2 senior citizens as the front runners going into 2024. So Mike said, this is a unique opportunity to see someone like relatively in our age range, in the 40s and 50s, debating, because we are not going to see that probably for quite some time.
Yeah. One other thing that I think has been upended as well, I was looking at getting texts from people about the debate last night, and one other thing, and I talk about this with my students, going back to the 1960s and the debate between JFK and Nixon. It's a classic debate where it's the first time it's being televised. If you heard it on the radio, you thought Nixon won. If you watched it on TV, you think JFK won. And people were texting me saying oh, Newsom crushed it. I was like, really? You think so? I said, well, I only saw the highlights on social media.
Yeah.
And I think there's this real difference between seeing clips. This is the era that we're living in, is this clip era and what algorithm you have, right? Versus actually sitting down and watching the 95 minutes or something as well. So I do feel like we've upended our consumption of these debates as well. And I think that's something that has already changed and will continue to be true in the future. And it makes me worried.
Yeah. No, I mean, and kind of a debate where both candidates won in the sense that, like, if you came into this a Newsom supporter or a Democrat, you probably thought he won. And if you came into it a DeSantis, usually in regular debates, like, it doesn't matter who you like, it's the performance, right? And here, I don't know that it was. Yeah. Totally upended. Well, let us turn now to the latest in city politics, because there is a lot being upended there as well. When it comes to redistricting, this week, the city council took a decisive step on putting this measure on the ballot next fall on whether or not California will have LA, the city of LA will have an independent redistricting commission. Sarah, I just want to remind, if folks haven't listened to all of our other episodes, which you should, that Sarah, of course, was one of just 14 out of millions of Californians who was on our statewide independent redistricting commission. So you know a thing or two. Yeah. You were privy to some kind of behind-the-scenes chats about this before it all went down as well.
Yeah.
Like, just thoughts.
Yeah. So, in addition to being a part of the Independent Redistricting Commission for the state, I've been a part of a group of scholars. We refer to ourselves as the LA Governance Reform Project. We've talked about it in the past on the podcast. And we have been in this process of developing a host of recommendations for LA City Council on how to make some broad governance reforms. One of them being independent redistricting. We were honestly quite surprised to see this moving forward right now. They decided this right before Thanksgiving, and on Monday we got notice that they would be voting on it.
Which some people said this was Paul Krikorian, like pulling the old, Thanksgiving, no one looking at this.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's right. And we were like, wait, but there's more to say and more to do, and this is
a lot to figure out.
Yes, exactly. And look, at the end of the day, the piece that has moved forward looks pretty good. It actually includes many of the recommendations that our group, as well as many community groups, had advocated for. And so I definitely want to applaud the city council for moving that forward. No. Well, sure. I mean, it's one step, and it was a step that does the least harm to themselves. This is we've talked about this before as well. This commission would not be seated until after the next census. There had been much debate amongst community groups about, do we put this in action prior to that and redraw the lines sooner? Yeah. So this is something that most of the politicians who are there today will never feel the effects of. There's also just a whole host of questions about what else will you be doing? Because the conversation has been about ethics reforms, right? Bringing additional scrutiny to yourselves, in which this is a body that has faced many members have faced various corruption charges and ethical violations. Some are now, heading to jail for these kinds of violations. Council expansion. This has been a major conversation throughout the city. We have only 15 members serving a city of about 4 million people. Yeah. We are the second largest city in the country and have the smallest city council. If we want to rebuild trust in governance, which at this point in time, Angelenos are sorely lacking, and for very good and obvious reasons, maybe we need to have smaller district sizes to actually bring politicians closer to the people. Yeah. And so there's a whole host of other things. And so I'm really curious to see to what extent the ad hoc governance committee will continue to advance any of these. They did meet this week after the vote on independent redistricting. They said that they do want to move forward independent budgeting for the ethics committee. They said that maybe having some sort of commission to evaluate future charter reforms could be a possibility. Let's see. And I think it's up to many of the community members and advocates to really maintain some of the pressure on City Council to continue moving forward.
Well, look, and I feel like there's the tip of the iceberg, and then there's everything below the water that you might not see, right? Especially after last fall's leaked recorded conversation, which, yes, a lot of ugly, racist, terrible remarks made, but it was also a really big conversation around redistricting. I think it'd be a really hard stance to take as a current city council member to say, I am not for an independent redistricting commission. Like, no one's going to say that. Yeah. And yet, how exactly, like Imelda Padilla was bringing up, because I think one of the things in this plan was that you could be, as long as you were in LA for 3 years, you could be on this independent redistricting commission. There's also some rules, like if you're on this commission, you can't then go ahead and run for city council.
Right.
But Padilla made the point, and I don't think that she's wrong, like 3 years in terms of LA time is nothing.
Yeah.
And like during that time, you might not have even participated in a city election, and that you should somehow be able to weigh in on this. So there were some questions about that. And also, I think this gave an opportunity for the council members who we know do not see eye to eye on a lot of things to bring up some of their own grievances on how this went down. So the big drivers behind this push for independent redistricting, even before the leaked tapes, was Nithya Raman and Paul Krikorian. They often talk about working on this at great length together. But during the city council meeting this week, if you watched, a number of folks gave speeches, and one of them was Monica Rodriguez, who pretty much got up there and said, I did not like the way that redistricting happened last time. I'm looking at you, Nithya Raman, who apparently went through 3 different every council member gets to appoint who's their person on this
in the current
structure.
Yeah.
And apparently Nithya Raman came and went through a couple of them. That was something that Monica Rodriguez talked about in her speech. Check it out.
I watched in real time members like Ms. Raman replacing their commissioners very rapidly to try and help ensure that what their goals were met. And so I just want to make sure that what we have going forward is a process that will respect the communities that deserve to have an opportunity to be represented in these moments. And so let's say, yes, we recognize those that were involved and who was engaged in these things, but I'm not going to, there were a lot more hands involved than we've ever really given recognition to.
And Sarah, I had to go back and listen a couple of times. You can hear in the background, you can do the little rewind thing on this podcast. You can hear Nithya Raman in the background say, seriously? Like, these folks are not happy with each other. What's that all about? Like, explain that.
I think I'm guessing here that Monica Rodriguez is pointing to the fact that, like, look, these leaked tapes were terrible. And they brought so much scrutiny to those who were involved. But let's get real. Everybody who was a sitting member of the city council at that time was involved at some level. And that was really what our research also showed, even when looking at ex parte communications. And these are the communications between their appointed commissioners and the city council members or their staff. What was interesting is what came out was those communications, actually the person who had the most communications was Marquise Harris Dawson, followed by Nithya Raman. So it's not to say, when I hear Monica Rodriguez kind of pointing to this, she's trying to remind people, like, yeah, y'all can like blame Nuri Martinez and the others, but everybody played a role in this. And I think we have to be real about that, especially when we're looking at various changes to this independent redistricting structure, which came about specifically around this issue of asset gerrymandering.
And will you remind folks, too, because I think it's important, remind folks what assets are and how they came up in the tapes, because it was a big part of the tapes.
Yeah, exactly. So you hear in the tapes people talking about, like, where will USC go? Which district will it be in? And I have to say, this came up at the state commission as well. Yeah. We came to a point where we were pretty much done with our lines. And suddenly we had all of this new testimony coming in saying, oh, we want LAX moved to this district. We want this mall moved to this other district. We want the Staples Center or LA Live. It's no longer the Staples Center. The crypto.com. We put it into this other district. Why is that happening? And as commissioners, we really had to scratch our heads and like, this has very little to do with representation. Very little to do. No, what the reason
representation is people.
And why sitting members, why incumbents want these things in their district is because those players, those folks with these quote unquote assets, they have a whole lot of money. They have a lot of interests in terms of the kinds of laws that get passed, land use laws, making sure that you're able to get police protection for various events. And they give big campaign finance donations. And so this is one of the key components is like, this has very little to do with representation and yet got brought up again and was added as a new requirement. Now the original proposal brought forth by Krikorian and Raman and this committee was clean from that. And Marquise Harris Dawson brings it back in, saying commissioners should, not may, but should consider these assets in redistricting. And I for me personally, having sat on one of these commissions, I thought that was pretty ridiculous.
It sounds like you're saying it's a slippery slope. And I hear you. I really, really do, especially when it comes to the campaign aspect of it and what that can mean for candidates and politicians. But when it comes to, again, upending the system, I'm going to push back a little bit because I was actually pretty moved by what Eunices Hernandez said during this council meeting. And basically she said this whole notion of assets hits really differently for folks like me and folks living in districts like mine because we're poor. And look, right, like, sure, assets aren't people, but if we're talking about redistricting as an aspirational way to try to bring a bit more equity to everybody in this city, I don't see how you don't include places as part of that, because otherwise I worry that you keep cutting the pie where certain Tony West Side districts are going to get all the goods. And then, you know, and my concern too, that these assets are going to have influence whether you like it or not. They're just going to. So do we wind up with these weirdo districts that make up no sense whatsoever because of the battle over them? And I think it's just really hard where it's, you know, you don't want this factor to influence. And I also don't know how it doesn't influence the conversation. I think it's a hard one.
To the best of my knowledge, this is the first jurisdiction in the nation who has added assets to redistricting language. So think about the precedent that is setting. That's right. And we're sending a clear message to these future commissions to identify such assets. What constitutes an quote unquote asset, right?
No, that's true.
Our communities now going to have to define those. Our schools' assets, our rivers' assets. Like what constitutes that? Our bus lines and assets.
Yeah.
I mean, we already have language about communities of interest, which include economic areas.
Yeah.
I'll give you a great example. In Orange County, we had folks calling in and saying, look, the areas around Knott's Berry Farm and Disney are working class. And it is predominantly folks who are working in those service industries, and we want them to be kept together because they are low income. And we did that. What that means is that now Disney and Knott's Berry Farm are in a district. But I think that there's ways to go up. That was already a part of the language. It was already flexible enough for this. So now tying the hands of commissioners to start thinking about what an asset is to try and define it. This is something that very well could wind up in the courts, and the courts are going to have to adjudicate this in 2033.
Well, you know, that's what Marquise Harris Dawson said when he talked about assets. He said it's like the Voting Rights Act. It is aspirational. You know, it's not so much that it's perfect, but we know if we don't do something like this, here's what could go wrong.
I wanted to vomit when I heard him say that. The Voting Rights Act.
How did you really feel, Sarah?
No, I mean, come on. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed by Martin Luther King Jr. Come on. Assets? No.
See, I heard it in a different way. I heard, right, there's no system that's perfect, but we got to try. And I think that's a great way to seg to our third topic this week, which is Governor Gavin Newsom's CARE, Community Assistance Recovery Empowerment. I think I'm pretty sure I've said it enough times now that that's what it stands for. But basically, we've talked about it before. This is his plan, which is really, I just want to, because I've been talking about it a bit this week, and I think it's really important to remember the context of this. You know, we grew up as a society and as a culture really not understanding a lot about how the brain works. So you could have a kid with autism and an adult with full-blown schizophrenia who were all just kind of considered in the same way. And the prevailing attitude for many years was away. Like you just put these people away in institutions. We had something like 14 huge mental institutions. At one point, the peak of it, I think this was somewhere late 50s, early 60s, there was a population of roughly 37,000 people living in these mental institutions, right? There are cities in Southern California that are smaller than that. It's really kind of astounding. And there were many ways in which that structure was working, right? They got wraparound support services, right? But there was a lot, and it was a huge economic generator, lots of jobs, but there was also lots of ways where it wasn't working. People were not, probably a lot of people who could have had much better, happier, healthier lives weren't
outside
getting
of the system.
And a lot because we didn't
and couldn't
understand
advocate
it.
for themselves to get out of it.
No,
right.
not at all.
Yeah.
Sometimes I was reading, there was a report that came out in the 60s that judges spent on average less than 5 minutes deciding whether or not people should be sent to these institutions. Can you imagine that the rest of your life based on 4 minutes of what a judge says is, I mean, it literally makes me nauseous thinking about it. But anyway, in that context, in the 60s, there was this something called the Lanterman-Petra Short Act. It was 3 members of our state legislature, 2 Democrats, 1 Republican, who got together and said, let's upend this system instead of having these big mental institutions. Why don't we break that system up, get people back in their communities? And like, if you think about it, that makes sense, right? Bring people, it's like mainstreaming kids who are neurodivergent, right? Like, we shouldn't exclude them. We should be more inclusive. You can make a strong case for it. Their case to Ronald Reagan was, this is going to save you a ton of money, right? You can close down all these institutions. Won't it be great? But it didn't work out that way at all. And a lot of people now look back at the choices we made then and say that that is no small part why we have thousands of people living on our streets today who are really, really struggling. So along comes Gavin Newsom, who a while back said, I'm launching this care court. It's going to make it a lot easier to get people into treatment. It's kind of been a slow roll throughout the state. Orange and Riverside have already launched this. It is launching this week, December 1st, here in LA County, which of course will be the biggest county. And as I said at the outset, I think this could go either way.
Yeah.
If this really works towards getting people and families who are trying to help their loved ones help, and it brings down the population, and not just the population overall, but probably the most intense and traumatic examples of homelessness in this state, it will be Gavin Newsom's legacy. If it doesn't work out that way, it would be Gavin Newsom's legacy.
Yeah, that's right. And it's really that question, like, are we going back to what we had before? Or is this some new moderating ground? Civil rights groups from the get-go have raised a host of concerns about this. About this program, and notably, it was fast-tracked here in Los Angeles. It wasn't actually supposed to roll out, I think, until 2025 in LA, and LA County officials said, no, we want to bring it. Let's get this ball rolling, and with that, it brought in all sorts of resources to kind of set this up and to have these resources available. I think one of the interesting things about the Care Court is it's kind of gone back and forth. Is this a measure to address people experiencing homelessness, or is this a measure specifically for mental health? I think we've pulled back from it solely being a homelessness feature, and instead it's really focused on people suffering from things like schizophrenia. They estimate that here in LA, within the first year, we could have up to 4,500 people in that system, estimated 7 to 12,000 statewide.
Some early numbers have come in that I heard recently for Orange County and Riverside. It's been in the first month about 20 cases, but it's like this is, you hear Care Court being discussed as people being compelled into treatment, but it is not that severity that we saw in the 60s. So I think that'll be a big question too. I heard today a mental health worker in Riverside talking about we keep going out there to people where families or loved ones have recommended they really could use this help. And if that individual doesn't want it, this isn't that draconian where they have to get it. So, that could be, you invest so much in developing the system and talking about it, and then the people who are supposed to be in it say, nope, no thanks. I'm not taking up on these services. And then where does that leave you?
Well, and that's one of the family members. That's been a really broad narrative throughout this process, is family members coming forth saying, hey, my son, my daughter, my brother, my sister, they're living on the streets and they need help. We're trying to get them help. And all of these narratives and stories kind of coming out through multiple media sources about, family members who drive around the streets trying to find their loved ones, to make sure they've eaten a meal, to make sure that in cold weather they have some warm clothes, looking out for them and wanting the state and wanting these courts to exist to try and get help for their loved ones.
And finally, today, a very sad news here in the state of California, that the first woman to serve as a justice on the United States Supreme Court has passed away at the age of 93. Sandra Day O'Connor, who was born in the West, not in California, but went to Stanford when she was just 16 years old. Super smart woman who graduated law school in 2 years instead of 3, but then couldn't even get a job, a paid legal job, because they didn't offer them to women in the law. They just didn't have them back in the day here in California. That led to her working finally in an unpaid position where she was at least able to use her law degree, and was so impressive that eventually went on to start her own law firm, had a career in state politics as well, and eventually tapped by former California governor turned U.S. President Ronald Reagan to be the first female Supreme Court. And I feel like, she upended. So like these days we take it for granted, right? You can see dogs in little T-shirts with like Ruth Bader Ginsburg's face on it. And you're like, oh yeah, women on the Supreme Court, no big deal. Yeah. But it was a big deal. It
was. And I think it's easy for us to forget what a big deal it really was, right? I mean, even today, of course, we talk about the challenges that women in the working world continue to face, the many hats that we're constantly wearing and priorities that we're juggling. But there are very real barriers that existed to our presence in the workforce at all. I think it's really highlighted by that story. Sandra Day O'Connor, of course, being a Reagan appointee, a slightly more conservative justice to be certain, but certainly during a time period where, by today's standards, I think you would probably identify her as more of a moderate. Yeah. Certainly, I think one of the key court rulings that I recall from Sandra Day O'Connor was Bush v. Gore, and the outcome of the election in 2000, and which the Supreme Court had to weigh in on, essentially handing the election to George W. Bush.
Yeah. She talked about how hard it was to be the first, especially because she said if you don't do it right, then you wind up being the last, something that we've heard echoed in days since from our now Vice President Kamala Harris. And part of the reason that she stepped down from the Supreme Court, which wound up leading to this slow, and we're seeing it, very steady shift to the right, was because her husband was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and she stepped down to take care of them. And I just can't think of many male figures who would necessarily step down to take care of a wife. Like usually that kind of thing is farmed out. So as one woman who knows a little bit about what it's like, balancing work and life and family, and Sarah, I know you do too, a moment of remembrance and gratitude for Sandra Day O'Connor for all that she did and for leading the way. That is it for us this week, because we're going to get back to juggling our own lives and let you do the same. We always love to hear your thoughts on what we're talking about. You can find me on social media at Alex Cohen in LA.
And I'm at Sara Sadhwani.
And we'll see you here next week. The Inside the Issues podcast is a Spectrum News One production. Crystal Goss is our producer. Nathaniel Leathers is our editor. The executive in charge of production is Jeff Shore.